The rope burned against Pierce Nathanson's neck as the mob dragged him toward the ancient oak tree on the edge of Bandera, Texas. And he knew with absolute certainty that he had exactly 3 minutes left to live. It was August of 1878, and the summer heat made the air shimmer like liquid glass, distorting the faces of the men who had already condemned him without a proper trial. His hands were bound behind his back with coarse hemp that cut into his wrists, and blood trickled down his fingers where he had struggled against the bonds during the 2-mile walk from the makeshift jail. "String him up," shouted Jacob Thornton, the cattle baron whose son lay dead in the town cemetery. "My boy is in the ground because of this murderer." Pierce tried to speak, to explain once more that he had not killed anyone, but his throat was too dry and his voice came out as nothing more than a rasp. He had been working as a ranch hand for the past 6 months, saving every dollar to buy a piece of land of his own. Then Samuel Thornton had been found shot in the back near the river, and Pierce's rifle had been discovered nearby. He had been fishing that morning and left his weapon against a cottonwood tree while he waded into the water. Someone had used it to kill Samuel and then disappeared, leaving Pierce to take the blame. The crowd numbered at least 40 people, their faces twisted with righteous anger and the peculiar excitement that came from witnessing a hanging. Pierce recognized most of them from town. There was the blacksmith, the general store owner, the saloon keeper, and dozens of ranch hands and farmers. Not one of them would meet his eyes now, though they had been friendly enough when he had money to spend. The oak tree loomed before him, its branches thick and strong enough to bear a man's weight. Someone had already thrown a rope over the highest branch, and the noose dangled in the hot breeze like a snake waiting to strike. Pierce felt his heart hammering against his ribs, and his legs turned to water. He had always imagined he would die in a more honorable way, perhaps defending something he believed in, not choking at the end of a rope for a crime he had not committed. "Wait," a voice called out, clear and strong despite the roar of the crowd. "Wait just 1 minute." The mob turned as one, and Pierce saw a woman pushing her way through the press of bodies. She was tall for a woman, perhaps 5 feet and 8 inches, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. Her dress was simple calico, faded from many washings, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from facing down hardship and surviving. Pierce had seen her around town but had never spoken to her. Her name was Margaret Ashford, and she ran a small ranch on the outskirts of Bandera with her elderly father. "What do you want, Margaret?" Jacob Thornton demanded, his face red with anger and grief. "This does not concern you." "It concerns every person in this town," Margaret said, stepping forward until she stood between Pierce and the tree. "You are about to hang a man without a proper trial, without evidence, without even listening to his side of the story. Is that the kind of justice we want in Bandera?" "We have evidence," Thornton said, spitting tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. "His rifle killed my son." "His rifle was found near the body," Margaret corrected. "That does not mean he pulled the trigger. Anyone could have taken that rifle and used it. Did you check for other tracks? Did you look for witnesses? Did you even ask who else might have wanted your son dead?" A murmur ran through the crowd, and Pierce saw several men exchange uncertain glances. Margaret pressed her advantage, her voice ringing out across the assembled mob. "I was at the river that morning," she said. "I saw Pierce Nathanson fishing, just like he said. He was there for at least 2 hours, peaceful as could be. I also saw someone else near those cottonwood trees, someone wearing a dark hat and riding a paint horse. I did not get a good look at his face, but I know it was not Pierce because Pierce was in the water the whole time." "Why did you not say something before?" Thornton demanded, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Because I did not hear about the murder until this morning when I came into town for supplies," Margaret said. "By then, you had already formed your mob and dragged this man from his cell. I came as fast as I could." Sheriff Coleman, who had been standing at the back of the crowd with his arms crossed and a troubled expression on his weathered face, stepped forward. He was an older man with gray hair and a thick mustache, and he had been sheriff of Bandera for more than 15 years. Pierce had noticed that he had not participated in the mob's fervor, though he had not stopped it either. "Margaret Ashford has never been known to lie," the sheriff said slowly. "If she says she saw someone else, then we need to investigate properly before we do something we cannot undo." "My son is dead," Thornton said, but the fire had gone out of his voice. He suddenly looked older, more fragile, a father grieving rather than an avenging angel. "And I am sorry for your loss," Margaret said gently, "but hanging an innocent man will not bring Samuel back. It will only add another death to the burden this town must bear." The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, like storm clouds breaking apart after thunder. Some men looked relieved, others disappointed, but none were willing to go against both Margaret Ashford and Sheriff Coleman. Thornton stood staring at Pierce for a long moment, then turned and walked away. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Sheriff Coleman cut the bonds from Pierce's wrists and removed the noose from around his neck. The rough hemp had left angry red marks on Pierce's skin, and he rubbed at them absently, still trying to process what had just happened. "You are a lucky man," the sheriff said. "Margaret saved your life today." Pierce turned to the woman who had stepped between him and death, searching for words adequate to express his gratitude. She was looking at him with those whiskey-colored eyes, assessing him in a way that made him feel both exposed and strangely safe. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice still hoarse. "I owe you my life." "You owe me the truth," Margaret said. "Did you kill Samuel Thornton?" "No," Pierce said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I swear on my mother's grave I did not kill him. I do not know who did, but it was not me." Margaret studied him for another moment, then nodded as if satisfied. "I believe you. Now we need to find out who really killed him before they decide to come after you again." Over the following days, Pierce discovered that Margaret Ashford was unlike any woman he had ever met. She ran her ranch with the efficiency of a military commander, managing livestock, mending fences, and handling the business side of operations with equal skill. Her father, Thomas Ashford, had been injured in a riding accident 5 years earlier and could no longer do heavy work, so Margaret had taken over most of the responsibilities. She employed 2 ranch hands, both Mexican brothers named Carlos and Roberto Martinez, who treated her with respect and loyalty. Pierce found work helping Margaret with various tasks around her property. He needed money and a place to stay, and she needed extra hands now that summer work was at its peak. The arrangement suited them both, though Pierce was aware that the entire town was watching to see what would develop between the woman who had saved him from hanging and the man who might still be a murderer. They worked together in a companionable silence most of the time, fixing a section of fence that had been damaged by a bull, moving cattle to better grazing land, and repairing the roof of the barn before the autumn rains arrived. Margaret was strong and capable, able to lift heavy posts and hammer in nails with the same ease as any man, but there was nothing mannish about her. She moved with a natural grace, and when she smiled, which was not often, her whole face transformed into something beautiful. Pierce found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating on a difficult task, the way her hands were strong but gentle when she tended to an injured calf. He had known women before, had even fancied himself in love once or twice, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of what he felt when he looked at Margaret Ashford. One evening, after they had finished the day's work and were sitting on the porch of the ranch house watching the sun set over the Texas hills, Margaret finally asked him about his past. "Where are you from originally?" she said, her voice quiet in the gathering dusk. "Missouri," Pierce said. "A little town near Kansas City that probably does not exist anymore. My parents had a farm, but they both died of fever when I was 16. I have been drifting ever since, working where I could find it, trying to save enough money to start over somewhere. What made you choose Texas?" "I heard there was good land here and opportunities for a man willing to work hard. I wanted to build something of my own, something that would last." He paused, then added, "Before this happened, I thought I was close to having enough saved up to buy a small piece of land. Now I do not know what to think." Margaret was quiet for a moment, staring out at the purple and gold sky. "You will get your land," she said finally. "Once we prove your innocence, you will get everything you worked for." "Why are you so sure I am innocent?" Pierce asked. "You do not really know me." She turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes seemed to glow from within. "I am a good judge of character," she said. "I have had to be, running this ranch on my own. You are not a killer, Pierce Nathanson. I knew that the moment I saw you standing under that tree with the rope around your neck. You had the look of a man who had been wronged, not a man who had committed a wrong." The words settled over Pierce like a warm blanket, easing some of the fear and uncertainty that had plagued him since Samuel Thornton's death. He wanted to reach out and take Margaret's hand, to thank her again for believing in him, but he did not quite dare. Instead, he simply said, "I will prove you right. I will find out who really killed Samuel Thornton." The investigation proved more difficult than Pierce had anticipated. Sheriff Coleman was willing to help, but he had few leads to follow. The paint horse that Margaret had seen could belong to any number of men in the area, and the dark hat was even less distinctive. Pierce spent his free time asking questions around town, trying to piece together who might have had a motive to kill Samuel Thornton. What he discovered surprised him. Samuel had been well liked in public, but privately, he had been a gambler and a cheat who owed money to several dangerous men. He had also been courting 2 different women at the same time, telling each of them that she was the only one. One of those women was the daughter of a wealthy rancher named Henry Carlisle, and the other was a saloon girl named Rose, who had recently disappeared from town. Samuel Thornton was not the golden boy his father thought he was, Pierce told Margaret one afternoon as they rode out to check on a herd of cattle in the western pasture. "He made a lot of enemies, and any one of them could have wanted him dead. Have you found Rose?" Margaret asked, guiding her horse around a clump of prickly pear cactus. "No, nobody has seen her since a week before Samuel was killed. Some people think she ran off to San Antonio, but I am not so sure. I think she might know something about what happened." "Or she might be in danger herself," Margaret said, her expression troubled. "If someone killed Samuel, they might have gone after Rose too." The thought had already occurred to Pierce, and it filled him with a cold dread. If Rose was dead, because of something Samuel had done, then proving Pierce's innocence might not be enough to stop the real killer. Whoever had murdered Samuel Thornton might be willing to kill again to protect their secret. That night, Pierce could not sleep. He lay on his bunk in the small cabin near the barn, staring up at the rough wooden ceiling and listening to the sounds of the night. Crickets sang in the grass, an owl hooted from the oak tree by the creek, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. He kept thinking about Margaret, about the way she had stood up to that mob without hesitation, about the quiet strength in her voice when she had told him she believed he was innocent. He had fallen in love with her. The realization came to him suddenly, with the force of a physical blow. He loved her courage, her intelligence, her kindness, and her fierce independence. He loved the way she treated her horses with gentleness and her enemies with steel. He loved the small smile that appeared when she was pleased with something and the way she hummed old songs while she worked. He loved everything about her, and the intensity of that love terrified him. Pierce had nothing to offer her. He was a suspected murderer with no land, no money, and no prospects. Even if he managed to prove his innocence, he would still be the man who had nearly been hanged in Bandera, Texas. Margaret Ashford deserved better than that. She deserved a man who could give her security and respect, not someone who had to fight for every scrap of dignity. But even as he thought these things, Pierce knew he could not walk away from her. She had saved his life, and in doing so, she had become as essential to him as breathing. Whatever happened, he would stay by her side for as long as she would let him. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Sheriff Coleman rode out to the ranch just after dawn, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat. "We found Rose," he said without preamble. "She is alive, but she is in bad shape. Someone beat her pretty badly and left her for dead in an abandoned line shack about 10 miles north of here. A couple of cowhands found her yesterday and brought her to Doc Harrison." "Can she talk?" Margaret asked, already moving toward the barn to saddle her horse. "Does she know who hurt her?" "She is conscious, but she is scared," the sheriff said. "She will not say much, but she keeps asking for you, Margaret. I do not know why, but she seems to think you are the only person she can trust." Margaret glanced at Pierce, and he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. It was the first time he had ever seen her look uncertain, and it made him want to gather her into his arms and promise that nothing would ever hurt her. Instead, he simply said, "I will come with you." "So will I," said Thomas Ashford, emerging from the house with his walking stick. He was a tall man, thin from his years of illness, but there was still strength in his weathered face. "If Rose is in danger, then Margaret might be too. I will not let my daughter walk into a trap." They rode into town together, the four of them moving at a fast pace across the sun-baked Texas landscape. Pierce kept close to Margaret, watching the surrounding country for any sign of trouble. If someone had tried to kill Rose to keep her quiet, they might try again, and anyone who helped Rose would become a target as well. Doc Harrison's office was a small building on Main Street, clean and neat, despite the primitive conditions. The doctor himself was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and steady hands, and he greeted them with obvious relief. "She is in the back room," he said quietly. "I have done what I can for her injuries, but she needs rest and someone to look after her. She is terrified, and I do not blame her. Whoever did this to her wanted her to suffer." Rose was lying on a narrow bed, her face swollen and bruised almost beyond recognition. Her left eye was completely closed, and her lip was split in 2 places. One arm was in a sling, and Pierce could see bandages wrapped around her ribs beneath the thin cotton nightgown. Despite the extent of her injuries, she was conscious, and when Margaret entered the room, Rose's good eye filled with tears. "Thank you for coming," Rose whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did not know who else to trust." Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed and took Rose's uninjured hand in both of hers. "You are safe now," she said gently. "Nobody is going to hurt you again. Can you tell me what happened?" Rose looked past Margaret to where Pierce and Sheriff Coleman stood near the door, and fear flickered across her battered face. Margaret followed her gaze, then turned back to Rose. "These men will not hurt you," she said. "Pierce Nathanson is the man who was accused of killing Samuel Thornton, but he is innocent. We are trying to find out who really killed Samuel, and we think you might know something that could help us." Rose closed her eye and drew a shuddering breath. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, though still filled with pain. "It was Frank Morrison," she said. "He killed Samuel, and he is the one who did this to me." Pierce felt his blood turn to ice. Frank Morrison was one of the most powerful men in the county, a rancher who owned thousands of acres and employed dozens of men. He was also known for his violent temper and his willingness to destroy anyone who crossed him. If Frank Morrison was the killer, then proving it would be nearly impossible, and anyone who tried would be putting their life at risk. "Why did Frank kill Samuel?" Sheriff Coleman asked, stepping forward with his notepad in hand. "Because Samuel found out that Frank was stealing cattle from other ranches and altering the brands," Rose said. "Samuel was in on it at first, helping Frank move the stolen cattle and keeping watch while Frank changed the brands. But then Samuel got greedy and wanted a bigger cut. He threatened to expose Frank if he did not get more money. Frank got angry and told Samuel he was finished, but Samuel would not let it go. He kept pushing, kept threatening. And Frank shot him," Pierce said, understanding now why his rifle had been used. "Frank knew I would be fishing that morning because I had mentioned it in the saloon the night before. He took my rifle and used it to kill Samuel, then left it there so I would take the blame." "That is right," Rose said. "I was there that morning. Samuel had asked me to meet him by the river because he wanted to talk about running away together. I was hiding in the trees when Frank showed up instead. I saw the whole thing. Frank and Samuel argued, and then Frank pulled out the rifle and shot Samuel in the back while he was trying to walk away. Frank saw me and came after me, but I ran. I have been hiding ever since, but he found me 3 days ago." "What did he do to you?" Margaret asked, though her face was pale and her hands were trembling. "He beat me and told me that if I ever told anyone what I saw, he would kill me and everyone I cared about," Rose said. "He left me in that old shack to die, but somehow I survived. I did not want to tell anyone because I was afraid, but when I heard that they were going to hang Pierce for something he did not do, I knew I had to speak up. I could not let an innocent man die for Frank Morrison's crime." Sheriff Coleman closed his notepad and looked at the others with a grave expression. "This is serious," he said. "If what Rose says is true, then Frank Morrison is guilty of murder, attempted murder, and cattle theft. But getting a conviction against a man like Frank will be difficult. He has money, power, and a lot of men who are loyal to him. We have to try," Margaret said, her voice fierce. "We cannot let him get away with this." "I agree," the sheriff said, "but we need to be smart about this. Frank will not go down without a fight, and if he thinks Rose can testify against him, he will try to finish what he started. Then we protect Rose," Pierce said. "We keep her somewhere safe until we can get Frank arrested and put on trial." Margaret looked at him with something like admiration in her eyes, and Pierce felt a surge of determination. He would do whatever it took to keep Margaret safe, to keep Rose safe, and to bring Frank Morrison to justice. The man had tried to frame him for murder, had beaten a defenseless woman nearly to death, and had stolen from honest ranchers trying to make a living. Frank Morrison deserved to hang, and Pierce would make sure he faced that justice. But first, they needed a plan. They moved Rose to the Ashford ranch that same day, settling her in the spare bedroom where Margaret could look after her. Doc Harrison came by twice a day to check on her injuries and change her bandages, and Pierce took turns with Carlos and Roberto standing guard over the property. They all knew that Frank Morrison would eventually realize that Rose had survived and come looking for her, and when he did, they needed to be ready. Sheriff Coleman began gathering evidence against Frank, questioning ranch hands and examining cattle for altered brands. What he discovered confirmed Rose's story. At least 3 different ranchers reported missing cattle, and several of the animals had been found on Frank Morrison's land with suspiciously fresh brands. The sheriff also found 2 men who were willing to testify that Frank had hired them to help move stolen cattle, though both men were terrified of what Frank might do to them if they spoke up in court. As the evidence mounted, Frank Morrison became increasingly desperate. He sent men to intimidate witnesses, offering bribes to some and threats to others. He tried to visit Rose at the Ashford ranch, but Pierce turned him away at the gate with a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. "You are not welcome here," Pierce said coldly. "Turn around and leave before I forget that the law says I cannot shoot you where you stand." Frank was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered with cold blue eyes and a cruel mouth. He looked at Pierce with contempt, but there was also a hint of fear in his expression. "You are making a mistake," Frank said. "That girl is lying. She is just a saloon whore trying to get attention. Nobody will believe her word over mine." "The sheriff believes her," Pierce said. "I believe her, and when this goes to trial, a jury will believe her too. You are finished, Frank." "You might as well accept it." Frank's face turned red with rage, and for a moment Pierce thought the man might try something foolish. But then Frank seemed to master himself, and he smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "We will see," Frank said. "This is not over." He turned his horse and rode away, but Pierce watched him go with a sense of foreboding. Frank Morrison was not the kind of man to give up easily, and Pierce knew that the real danger was just beginning. That night, Pierce found Margaret sitting on the porch again, staring out at the stars. The August heat had given way to the slightly cooler temperatures of early September, and a gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees. She looked tired, the strain of the past few weeks showing in the shadows under her eyes and the tense set of her shoulders. "How is Rose?" Pierce asked, sitting down beside her. "She is healing," Margaret said. "Her bruises are starting to fade, and Doc Harrison says her ribs will mend in a few more weeks, but she is still scared. She has nightmares every night about Frank coming back to finish what he started." "We will not let that happen," Pierce said firmly. "I will protect her, and I will protect you too." Margaret turned to look at him, and in the moonlight her eyes were luminous. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You could have left Bandera weeks ago, started over somewhere else where nobody knows about Samuel Thornton. Why are you still here?" Pierce knew this was the moment to tell her the truth, to lay his heart bare and risk everything on the chance that she might feel the same way he did. He took a deep breath and met her gaze without flinching. "I am here because of you," he said. "You saved my life, Margaret, and in doing so, you gave me something I had not felt in a long time. You gave me hope. You made me believe that there was still goodness in the world, still people worth fighting for. I'm here because I cannot imagine being anywhere else, because every day I spend working beside you is a gift I do not deserve, but will never take for granted." He paused, then added quietly, "I am here because I love you, Margaret Ashford. I love you with everything I am, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the faith you showed in me." Margaret stared at him, her lips parted in surprise, and for a terrible moment Pierce thought he had made a mistake. But then she smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face, and she reached out to take his hand. "I love you too," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I think I have loved you since that day I saw you standing under the oak tree with the rope around your neck. You looked so lost, so alone, and all I could think was that I could not let you die. I could not let the world lose someone as good as you." Pierce felt his heart swell with joy so intense it was almost painful. He pulled Margaret close and kissed her, tasting salt from the tears that were streaming down both their faces. She kissed him back with a fierceness that spoke of all the loneliness and fear she had carried for so long, and Pierce knew that he had finally found the place where he belonged. They sat together on the porch for hours, talking about their dreams and fears, making plans for a future that suddenly seemed bright and full of possibility. Margaret told him about how hard it had been to run the ranch alone, about the men who had tried to cheat her or drive her out, about the nights when she had cried herself to sleep wondering if she was strong enough to keep going. Pierce told her about his years of drifting, about the emptiness he had felt never having a place to call home, about the moment he had realized he wanted to build a life in Texas. "We can build that life together," Margaret said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Once this is over, once Frank Morrison is behind bars and you are cleared of all charges, we can get married and run this ranch as partners. My father would love that. He has been worried about what would happen to me and the ranch after he is gone." "I would be honored to marry you," Pierce said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will work hard every day to make you happy, to give you the life you deserve." "You already make me happy," Margaret said simply. "Just by being here, by believing in me the way I believed in you." They were so caught up in each other that they did not hear the footsteps approaching until it was too late. A voice called out from the darkness, harsh and mocking. "How touching," Frank Morrison said, stepping into the circle of light cast by the porch lantern. He had a gun in his hand, pointed directly at Margaret. "Too bad this is where your little love story ends." Pierce moved instinctively, putting himself between Margaret and the gun, but Frank just laughed. "I can shoot through you to get to her," Frank said. "But I would rather you both live long enough to watch what happens to that lying saloon girl." "Where is she?" "Inside the house." "You are not getting anywhere near her," Pierce said, his voice cold and steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Sheriff Coleman knows everything, Frank. He has witnesses, evidence, everything he needs to convict you. Killing us will only make things worse." "I do not care anymore," Frank said, and Pierce could hear the desperation in his voice. "I have lost everything because of you people. My ranch, my reputation, my freedom. If I am going down, I am taking all of you with me." He raised the gun, and Pierce braced himself for the bullet, but it never came. Instead, there was a loud crack, and Frank stumbled forward with a look of surprise on his face. He dropped to his knees, the gun falling from his hand, and Pierce saw the growing red stain spreading across the back of his shirt. Thomas Ashford stood in the doorway of the house, a smoking rifle in his hands. His face was pale but determined, and his voice was steady when he spoke. "I heard you threatening my daughter," he said. "In Texas, a man has the right to defend his family and his property. You should have remembered that before you came here." Frank tried to speak, but blood bubbled from his mouth instead of words. He collapsed face first into the dust and lay still. Pierce checked for a pulse and found none. Frank Morrison was dead. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Sheriff Coleman arrived with his deputy, and after hearing the statements from Pierce, Margaret, Thomas, and Rose, he declared that Thomas had acted in self-defense. Frank Morrison had been trespassing with intent to kill, and Thomas had done what any father would do to protect his family. "This closes the case," the sheriff said, looking at Pierce with something like respect. "Frank Morrison killed Samuel Thornton, beat Rose nearly to death, and tried to frame you for murder. With Frank dead and the evidence we have gathered, there is no question about what really happened. You are a free man, Pierce Nathanson. Your name is cleared." Pierce should have felt relief, but all he felt was exhaustion and a deep sadness for all the lives that had been damaged by one man's greed and violence. Samuel Thornton was dead. Rose would carry the scars of her beating for the rest of her life, and Frank Morrison had thrown away everything for stolen cattle and pride. But there was also hope. With Frank's death, the danger was over, and Pierce and Margaret could finally begin to build the life they had talked about. The town of Bandera slowly came to accept that Pierce had been innocent all along, and Jacob Thornton even came to the Ashford ranch to apologize for trying to hang him. "I was blinded by grief," the old man said, his voice heavy with regret. "I wanted someone to pay for my son's death, and you were convenient. I am sorry for what I almost did to you." "I forgive you," Pierce said, shaking the man's hand. "You lost your son. I cannot imagine that kind of pain." "He was not the man I thought he was," Thornton said quietly. "I have been learning things about Samuel that make me wonder if I ever really knew him at all, but he was still my boy, and I will mourn him." As September turned to October, the Texas landscape transformed from the harsh brown of summer to the softer golds and greens of autumn. The heat lessened, the rains came, and the grass grew thick and lush across the Ashford ranch. Pierce worked alongside Margaret every day, mending what needed mending, building what needed building, and slowly becoming part of the fabric of the ranch. Rose recovered from her injuries and decided to leave Bandera for a fresh start in San Antonio. Margaret gave her enough money to get established, and Rose left with tears in her eyes and a promise to write. "You saved my life," Rose said, hugging Margaret tightly. "Both of you, I will never forget that." "You were brave to tell the truth," Margaret said. "You helped save Pierce's life too, and for that, I will always be grateful." On a cool October morning, with the sky bright and clear, Pierce Nathanson and Margaret Ashford were married in the small church in Bandera. Thomas Ashford gave his daughter away with tears of joy in his eyes, and Sheriff Coleman served as Pierce's best man. The whole town turned out for the wedding, eager to celebrate the couple who had survived so much and found love in the midst of tragedy. Margaret wore a dress of cream-colored silk that her mother had worn at her own wedding, and she had never looked more beautiful. Pierce wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion, and he felt like the luckiest man alive as he watched his bride walk down the aisle toward him. "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Pierce said, his voice clear and strong. "You take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Margaret said, smiling up at Pierce with so much love in her eyes that it took his breath away. "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Pierce gathered Margaret into his arms and kissed her deeply, feeling the joy and love radiating from her like warmth from a fire. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at the same time. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up under the oak trees and enough food to feed half the county. There was music and dancing, and Pierce found himself being congratulated by men who had been ready to hang him just a few months earlier. He accepted their good wishes with grace, knowing that holding on to bitterness would only poison the happiness he had found. As the sun began to set, and the guests started to leave, Pierce and Margaret stood together watching the last rays of light paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas had already gone to bed, tired from the excitement of the day, and the ranch hands had retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving the newlyweds alone. "Are you happy?" Pierce asked, pulling Margaret close. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said, resting her head against his chest. "There were so many times when I thought I would be alone forever, that I would never find someone who could understand what it means to fight for something you believe in. But then you came along and everything changed. You changed my life," Pierce said. "You gave me hope when I had none. You believed in me when everyone else wanted me dead, and you loved me when I had nothing to offer. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." "You already deserve me," Margaret said, tilting her face up for a kiss. "We deserve each other." They made their way to the house hand in hand, ready to begin their first night as husband and wife. The bedroom had been prepared with fresh linens and wildflowers, and as Pierce carried Margaret across the threshold, he felt a sense of profound gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought them together. That night, they came together with a passion and tenderness that spoke of all they had endured and all they hoped to build. Pierce explored every inch of Margaret's body with reverent hands, learning what made her sigh with pleasure and what made her cry out his name. Margaret was equally bold, claiming him with a possessiveness that thrilled him to his core. They made love slowly at first, savoring each touch and kiss, then with increasing urgency as need overtook them both. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window, both of them sated and content. "I love you," Margaret whispered, tracing patterns on Pierce's chest with her fingertips. "I love you too," Pierce said, kissing the top of her head. "Always and forever." The years that followed were not without challenges. Running a ranch in Texas in the late 1870s was hard work, requiring long hours and constant vigilance against drought, disease, and the ever-present threat of cattle thieves. But Pierce and Margaret faced every obstacle together, their love growing stronger with each passing season. Thomas Ashford lived for another 5 years, long enough to see his daughter truly happy and to welcome his first grandchild into the world. He passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1883, leaving the ranch entirely to Margaret and Pierce. They mourned him deeply, but they also celebrated the good life he had lived and the legacy he had left behind. Margaret gave birth to their first child in the summer of 1879, a healthy baby boy they named Thomas after Margaret's father. The delivery was long and difficult, and Pierce had been terrified that he would lose both his wife and child, but Margaret was strong, and she came through it with determination and grace. Pierce held his son for the first time with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face, marveling at the tiny perfect fingers and the shock of dark hair so like Margaret's. "He is beautiful," Pierce said, his voice choked with emotion. "He has your eyes," Margaret said, exhausted but radiant as she watched her husband fall in love with their son. 2 years later, they had a daughter named Sarah, who inherited Pierce's stubborn nature and Margaret's fierce independence. She was followed 3 years after that by another son, William, who was gentle and thoughtful, more interested in books than in ranching but loved just as fiercely by his parents. The ranch prospered under Pierce and Margaret's management. They expanded their holdings, bought more cattle, and earned a reputation for honesty and fair dealing that brought them respect throughout the county. Pierce proved to have a natural talent for breeding horses, and the Nathanson horses became highly sought after throughout Texas and beyond. In 1885, Bandera built a new schoolhouse, and Margaret insisted that all 3 of their children attend regularly. Education was important to her, and she wanted her children to have opportunities that she had never had. Pierce supported her completely, even though it meant he had to hire more help to make up for the work the children would have done on the ranch. "I want them to have choices," Margaret said. "If Thomas wants to be a rancher, that is wonderful. But if Sarah wants to be a teacher or William wants to be a doctor, I want them to have the education and support to follow those dreams." "You are a wise woman," Pierce said, kissing her. "Our children are lucky to have you as their mother." "They are lucky to have you as their father," Margaret said. "You work hard, you treat people fairly, and you love us with everything you have. What more could any child ask for?" The town of Bandera grew and changed over the years. The railroad came through in 1887, bringing new settlers and new opportunities. The wild days of the frontier began to fade, replaced by a more settled and civilized existence. Pierce sometimes missed the adventure and uncertainty of those early years, but he would not have traded his life with Margaret and their children for anything. On their 10th wedding anniversary in October of 1888, Pierce took Margaret to San Antonio for a long weekend, leaving the children in the care of Carlos and Roberto, who had become like family over the years. They stayed in a fancy hotel, ate at nice restaurants, and attended a theater performance, living like wealthy city folk for a few precious days. "This is lovely," Margaret said as they strolled through the plaza in the evening, her hand tucked into the crook of Pierce's arm. "But I will be happy to get home to our children and our ranch." "So will I," Pierce said. "This is nice for a visit, but our real life is back in Bandera. That is where we belong." They returned home to find that the children had been perfect angels, though Roberto admitted with a laugh that Sarah had tried to ride one of the half-broken horses and had been scolded soundly for her recklessness. "She is so much like you," Pierce said to Margaret that night as they lay in bed. "I know," Margaret said ruefully. "I pray every night that she does not give us as much trouble as I gave my father." "We will manage," Pierce said. "We always do." As the years continued to pass, Pierce and Margaret watched their children grow into capable, confident young adults. Thomas took to ranching naturally, and by the time he was 20, he was managing much of the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Sarah did indeed become a teacher, opening a small school for the children of ranch hands and farmers who lived too far from Bandera to attend the regular school. William surprised everyone by developing a passion for law, and Pierce and Margaret scraped together the money to send him to study in Austin. "I want to make sure people like you get fair treatment," William told his father when he announced his decision. "I know what almost happened to you, and I know that there are still people who do not get justice because they cannot afford lawyers or because the system is rigged against them. I want to change that." Pierce embraced his son, proud beyond words of the man he had become. By the time Pierce and Margaret celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in 1898, the world had changed dramatically from the rough frontier days of the 1870s. Texas was fully settled, the Indian Wars were over, and the Wild West was becoming a thing of legend and nostalgia. But Pierce and Margaret had built something lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone. They stood together on the porch of their ranch house, the same spot where Pierce had first told Margaret he loved her 20 years earlier. They were both older now, with gray beginning to show in their hair and lines etched around their eyes, but they were still strong, still together, still deeply in love. "You ever think about that day under the oak tree?" Margaret asked, leaning against Pierce's shoulder. "Sometimes," Pierce said. "I think about how close I came to dying and how you saved me. I think about what my life would have been if you had not stepped forward that day." "I think about it too," Margaret said. "I think about how scared I was and how I almost did not speak up. What if I had been too afraid? What if I had stayed silent?" "But you did not," Pierce said, turning to face her and taking both her hands in his. "You were brave, and you saved my life, and in doing so you gave me everything I ever wanted. You gave me love, a family, a home, and a purpose. You gave me a reason to be the best man I could be." "And you saved me too," Margaret said, her eyes glistening with tears. "You saved me from loneliness, from despair, from the belief that I had to face everything alone. You became my partner in every sense of the word, sharing the work and the joy and the pain. We built this life together, and it has been more beautiful than I ever imagined." They kissed then, a long, slow kiss that held 20 years of love and commitment and shared dreams. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling, and Pierce felt the same surge of joy he had felt on their wedding day. "I love you, Margaret Nathanson," he said. "I love you too, Pierce Nathanson," she replied. "Always and forever." As the years continued to roll by, Pierce and Margaret settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long and happy marriage. They welcomed grandchildren into their lives as Thomas married a sweet-natured woman named Emma and started a family of his own. Sarah married a fellow teacher, and they built a small house near the school where they both worked. William returned from Austin with his law degree and opened a practice in Bandera, quickly becoming known as a fierce advocate for justice. Pierce and Margaret gradually stepped back from the daily operations of the ranch, turning more of the responsibility over to Thomas while they enjoyed the slower pace of their later years. They took pleasure in the simple things, watching the sun rise over the Texas hills, sitting on the porch in the evening, playing with their grandchildren, and spending time together after a lifetime of hard work. In the spring of 1910, Pierce fell ill with pneumonia. He was 71 years old by then, and despite Doc Harrison's best efforts and Margaret's devoted nursing, he grew weaker with each passing day. The whole family gathered at the ranch, knowing that the end was near. On a warm May evening, with Margaret holding his hand and his children and grandchildren gathered around his bed, Pierce Nathanson took his last breath. His final words were for his wife. "Thank you for saving me," he whispered. "Thank you for loving me. Thank you for giving me a life worth living." "Thank you for loving me back," Margaret said through her tears. "Thank you for building this beautiful life with me. Thank you for being everything I ever needed." Pierce smiled at her one last time, then closed his eyes and was gone. They buried him under the oak tree where they had first spoken of their love, the same tree where he had nearly died so many years before. The whole town of Bandera turned out for the funeral, paying their respects to a man who had proven his character through decades of honest living and hard work. Margaret stood at the graveside with her children and grandchildren around her, dry-eyed and composed, though her heart was breaking. After the funeral, Margaret remained at the ranch, refusing to leave the place where she had spent so many happy years with Pierce. She lived for another 8 years, watching her grandchildren grow and welcoming great-grandchildren into the world. She took comfort in knowing that Pierce's legacy lived on through their children, and through the ranch they had built together. When Margaret Ashford Nathanson died peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1918 at the age of 82, her family buried her next to Pierce under the oak tree. They placed a single headstone for both of them, with words chosen by their children, Pierce and Margaret Nathanson. Beloved parents and grandparents, they saved each other and built a legacy of love. The ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to the courage and love of the woman who had stepped forward to save a stranger from the noose, and the man who had spent his life proving her faith in him had not been misplaced. The oak tree grew tall and strong, its branches providing shade for countless family gatherings, and the story of Pierce and Margaret became part of the legend of Bandera, Texas, a reminder that love and courage could triumph over injustice and hatred. Their great-grandchildren would sit under that oak tree and listen to the story of how their great-grandmother had stood up to a mob and saved the life of the man who would become her husband, how they had fought together to expose a murderer, and how they had built a life filled with love, hard work, and unwavering commitment to each other. The story was passed down through the generations, a piece of family history that never lost its power to inspire and move those who heard it. In the end, what Pierce and Margaret had built lasted far longer than either of them could have imagined. Not just the ranch or the financial legacy, but the example they set of what true love looked like. They had shown their children and grandchildren that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made every day through actions and words and unwavering support. They had demonstrated that the strongest partnerships were built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the willingness to stand by each other through both triumph and tragedy. The legacy of Pierce and Margaret Nathanson lived on in every generation of their family, in the values they instilled and the love they shared. And somewhere in whatever comes after this life, two souls who had found each other against all odds remained together, eternally grateful for the day when one woman's courage had given them both a chance at the life they deserved.